The Souls series is easily one of my favorite video game franchises. Every installment has a special place in my heart, and always will. I found them at a difficult time in my life, and they helped me get through it, and I know that many others can say the same. The games have a certain something to them that makes people get attached and want more. The fanbase has grown drastically over the years, and continues to do so with each new installment. Most, if not all, fans have probably been asked to or have themselves ranked each game and created a list, declaring whatever sits at the top is without question the best of the games. For most people, Dark Souls 2 sits at the bottom of the list. It is a simple fact that Dark Souls 2 is the most disliked game in the Souls series. But when discussion about the game's quality is brought up, it always ends up being incredibly controversial. Many fans of the games don't even think it is worth playing, and even less so the Scholar of the First Sin edition. Yet many also have very fond memories of the game. Even those that like it often believe it is the worst game in the series, despite how much they care for it. So why is the topic of Dark Souls 2's quality so controversial? Why can't the fans agree that the game is either good or bad? Is it because it's a bad game that some enjoy regardless? Or is it a good game with a few bad qualities that some people can't get past? Or is it because our holy savior Miyazaki didn't direct it? Is it just not a good Souls game? Is Dark Souls 2 even a good game? When I decided I wanted to make a video covering this strangely controversial topic, I opened up Steam to reinstall Dark Souls 2, and in the Steam community page, one of the first things I saw was that someone had made a complete guide on how to uninstall the game. This post was surrounded by generally good-spirited posts of people enjoying the game, but it was quite ironic to see something that so perfectly encapsulated the divisiveness caused by the game immediately as I began to plan out this video. It is because of things like this, though, that I feel the need to state a reminder that what I say in this video is just my opinion, and you are free to feel however you want about the game. I will simply be stating my thoughts on aspects of the game and whether I think they are good or bad, and what my overall view of the game is. And if you disagree, that is completely fine. Starting off with the first thing you see in Dark Souls 2, the intro cinematic, I honestly think it is the best intro in the series. It creates such a strong desire to explore and learn about what's happening in the world and with the player character. Don't get me wrong, I like the cutscenes in the other games quite a bit, but they really just explain a bit of the history and lore behind what's happening in the game. Well, this one actually sets up a mystery with the undead curse and thrusts the story more onto the player character than in the other games. As a new player to the series, this one easily would have drawn me in the most with this cutscene alone if I had no prior knowledge of the games. It was actually the TV spot trailer for Dark Souls 2 that got me interested in the Souls series originally, so I'm quite a believer of how much power cinematics have. If I hadn't seen that trailer, I may have never had the pleasure of playing what are now some of my favorite games. The reason I mention this is that I feel like the intro cinematic of Dark Souls 2 has the same potential, whereas the intro cinematics in the other games really don't. After the cutscene, the player is thrust into the world before making a character, differentiating the start from the other games. I think this benefits the game in a similar way to the intro cinematic, by establishing your character as a part of the world and story that already exists before the character creation process. Unfortunately, this doesn't last long, and like the other games, there's little importance placed upon the player, which I get is part of the cycles enforced upon the world and the idea of countless undead undergoing the same journey, but it seems like they had some intention of doing more and just gave up on it. Regardless of their intentions for the player character, the game doesn't have a proper tutorial area, which some may like, but I personally feel that it lacks something in the early game without one. Both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 have a tutorial area that introduces the player to the game mechanics and ends in a boss fight that gives them a taste of what's ahead. Dark Souls 2, however, has an optional tutorial area with nothing but a few meaningless enemies and no boss to really test the player. If the player wants to, they can ignore it entirely. This could be seen as a benefit for people who have played the game countless times, or on subsequent playthroughs, where the tutorial area might just be tedious. That stuff aside, I do think it benefits Dark Souls 2 to have things betwixt be attached to the world, unlike in all of the other games, Bloodborne excluded. I find it makes the world flow together better when it's attached, rather than having it be completely cut off like the Northern Undead Asylum. The next point of order is Majula, which happens to be my personal favorite hub area in any of the games, with Hunter's Dream as a close second. Majula has a very homey feel that at least I find isn't replicated in the other games. The music and visuals are beautiful, making the player feel safe and at peace. The NPCs that you find in the world gather there and stay there, which is true for some, but not all of the games. I like the hub area in every game in the Souls series, but I don't like that the hub area isn't attached to the world in the other games. It feels strange to have to somewhat exit the world to level up, upgrade equipment, and in some of the games, increase healing capabilities. I know that Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 1 is also connected to the world, but it doesn't act as a hub area in the same way due to the game's mechanics. I love that in Dark Souls 2 you can walk or fall to 5 other areas of the game from the hub area. Which brings me to my next point of discussion, the world design, progression, and interconnectivity. The world design is obviously not as brilliant as it is in Dark Souls 1, but I find that people tend to forget that it also isn't in any of the other games. Dark Souls 2's world actually fits together, with some exceptions, better than, or at least equal to how it does in Dark Souls 3, Demon Souls, or Bloodborne. From Majula alone, you can see many other areas of the world, similar to how you can from the High Wall of Lothric in Dark Souls 3. The fact that Majula is attached to the world, unlike the High Wall, also helps with this. Being able to see these places and seamlessly walk to them establishes it as a somewhat tangible world, even though some of the distances may be a little off. There are, of course, a few exceptions, like the elevators into the sky in Earthen Peak and Aldia's Keep, or the short tunnel from the Shaded Woods to Drang Lake Castle and its instant change in weather. But even so, similar things happen in the other games too. Maybe not to quite the same extent always, but they still happen. As an example, after defeating the Abyss Watchers in Farron Keep, the player progresses into the Catacombs of Karthus, and then into Irithyll, where it out of nowhere becomes night with the moon shining brightly above. And yeah, I get that part of the story in Dark Souls 3 is the cycle coming to an end and worlds colliding because of that. But if you think about it, could it not also be said that some of these strange things in Dark Souls 2 are also due to the cyclical nature of the Age of Fire and places from different times colliding? For example, it could be interpreted from the lore that the reign of the Iron King was long before the Kingdom of Drang Lake, and the Iron Keep only exists in Drang Lake as a result of Vendrick failing to become a true monarch, as the Iron King had before him. With these few strange occurrences in the game world, it is often overlooked that the rest of the world fits together in a way that makes sense. Yes, it splits off into multiple branching paths, and that's not 100% ideal, but why is that deemed as more okay in the other games than it is in Dark Souls 2? In Demon Souls, none of the Archstones are at all connected to each other. They are all individual paths that eventually make you go back to the Boletaria Archstone to progress through the game. In Dark Souls 1, the later portion of the game has the same setup of branching paths as Dark Souls 2. And yeah, it's generally seen as not great, but everyone seems to accept it more and not judge it as harshly. In Dark Souls 3, the game is almost too linear, and the only branching paths other than Irithyll Dungeon are entirely optional. Other than the world's interconnectivity, I think Dark Souls 2 has a good sense of progression. Dark Souls 2 does the opposite of the first game by giving the choice of where to go in the early game, rather than late. As much as I like the somewhat linear nature of Dark Souls 1, I feel like the linear nature of the game is more fitting in the second half. I could see how it might not be the most beneficial for new players to be given choice over a linear structure, but regardless, I think that the early choice encourages players to explore and visit each of the paths they can and determine for themselves which way to progress. Then after the player has explored all they can and eventually comes to later stages of the game, it makes more sense to push them in a specific direction to wrap up the story. Having said that though, the choice of the developers to have the player go through the Undead Crypt to find Vendrick and then send them back to the Shaded Woods to go through Aldia's Keep is a little nonsensical. Then following that, having them go through the Giant Memories, which don't get me wrong, is a super cool idea, it's just maybe not the most sensical way to progress the story. Then after that, having the player go back to Castle Drang Lake to have the final battle in the Throne of Want is also a little messy, and not as linear as it should be. I also want to of course mention that the reason all of the Great Souls are needed is because the player character couldn't climb over some rubble. I mean, the developers could have at least put the Shrine of Winter on the path so that an actual structure blocked your way. So I definitely think that it is the better choice to have the linearity be in the later game, but I would agree that it could have been handled better and in a way that made more sense. Overall though, I think the way the game progresses in Dark Souls 2 is completely fine. Moving on, the world and level design is something that I don't think Dark Souls 2 gets nearly enough credit for. I know lots of people will hear this and get pissed off, but I honestly don't think the level design in Dark Souls 2 is really that bad, save a few areas. First off, I think the aesthetic and atmosphere is much better than people give it credit for. It's still not great, but it is better than the mute and dusty tone nothingness present in most of Dark Souls 3. When it comes to the levels, I find that I get pulled into replaying the game a ton because I simply enjoy the early game areas, specifically the Forest of Fallen Giants. The forest is a beautiful looking area with a lot of rich lore embedded into its existence, and it's the perfect place to start the game, especially for a new player. It's got a simple structure, but also a lot of depth. There are branching paths to explore, secrets, shortcuts, traps, a variety of good enemies to introduce players to the combat, to completely different bosses, and sections that you are meant to come back to later in the game. That's all in just one of the first areas of the game. A large amount of the other areas have just as many good qualities to them. I of course have to mention the main areas of the expansions, Shalva, the Broom Tower, and Aleum Lois, are all examples of amazing level design, which I will touch on more later when I talk about the DLC. Dark Souls 2's areas may not all be as great as some of the areas in the other games, but that doesn't make them bad. And yeah, there are the bad areas like the Shrine of Amana, the Black Gulch, No Man's Wharf, and all 4 of the DLC co-op areas, but does that really mean that the level design sucks? No, absolutely not. Most of the levels in the game are just fine, and people just don't give them the credit they deserve. I also want to quickly mention the darkness and torch mechanics that were supposed to be present in the game. The few areas in the game that are dark enough to actually require some sort of light, I have to say I really enjoy. I love that it gives an imposing sense of danger and dread as you go through these areas, and it's really unfortunate the reliance on torches that was advertised didn't really make it into the final game, because I feel like it would have added a lot to the atmosphere of the world. I'm not really going to talk about the story for a huge amount of time, because I really don't feel like its quality is really that different from that of the other games. Like most people, I play through the games, listen to the dialogue, maybe read a few item descriptions, and then go watch VOD video, so I'm definitely no expert when it comes to the story. For the most part, as with the others, it's told through item descriptions and the environment, and less through direct means. It's, in very simple terms, an expansion of the lore on the cycles present in the Age of Fire and the ending curse that comes with them, which is then expanded on in the Scholar of the First Sin edition, with ideas of Gwyn committing the first sin by prolonging the Age of Fire and not submitting to the natural order of the world. It's quite interesting stuff, and honestly a good enough story to keep the players at least somewhat invested in what's happening, but usually the story isn't, for the most part, why people get into these games. Not that the story isn't important, I'm just saying it doesn't really need to be anything that's completely in-your-face spectacular. I guess what I mean is that the story in Dark Souls 2 might be the worst in the series, but it's not completely abhorrent. It's still a good enough story for what the game needs, and that's really not something that the game should be mercilessly bashed for. The NPCs are one of the spots where Dark Souls 2 is definitely worse than the other games. For the most part, I just don't think they are really that memorable or have very engaging storylines. There are a few, like Lucatiel, that do have good stories and stand out, giving players some sense of connection, but I feel like other than a few of them, the rest are just forgettable. Other than Lucatiel, Pate, Creighton, Benhart, and maybe one other, how many can you really remember? The only reason I can think of more right now is because I just played through the game to get footage and take notes for this video. If they're good, but if they're not, they're forgettable, which is something I don't really feel can be said as much for the NPCs in the other games. Because NPCs are a huge part of what makes people connect with video games, I think Dark Souls 2 is less likely to give people that connection. Movement is the thing that I think makes most people hate Dark Souls 2 and is realistically the absolute worst thing about it. I don't even know how exactly to explain this. The movement in Dark Souls 2 is just awful. The way the player moves just feels kind of off. They walk, run, jump, and attack in a way that doesn't feel right. There's this weird thing where if the player holds a large weapon and a shield, they lean super awkwardly to one side, and I get what they were going for, but it just looks weird. The NPCs float around weirdly and look like their legs aren't attached to their bodies. They also target the player even if they're allies, which is just strange. The bosses and enemies have oddly timed attacks because the movements don't sync up with hitboxes. Some enemies have no tell for certain attacks, they just hit you without really moving. Every enemy tracks the player like it's on a turnstile. I mean, in Dark Souls 3, the enemies have good tracking, but it's through their movements that they track, not because they are just always facing you. The movement is just overall not good. I think the Falconers are easily the worst examples of this in the entire game. I know they're not super present in the base game, but they show up in multiple areas in Scholar of the First Sin, and I just can't get over how awful everything they do looks. Especially their run. It's just atrocious. The only exception to the horror movement is that the player character changes stances based on status. For example, if the player is heavily injured, they will hunch over and breathe heavily until healed. Other than that, the movement is just wrong, and I feel like if the movement were fixed to feel more like the other games, everyone would like Dark Souls 2 a lot more. This is one of the sections of the game that I think really shines. Dark Souls 2 has great combat, the best leveling system, and the best build variety by far. Starting with the combat, I think it has the highest skill cap in the series, but is still accessible enough to work for new players. With this, of course, I am mostly talking about PvP, however, it does also apply to PvE. Dark Souls 2 has the mechanics to really let those who want to do PvP experiment to find combos and builds that will keep others on their toes. It also got rid of problems present in Dark Souls 1 that caused people to find mechanics like toggle escaping, backstab cancelling, and so on. They also changed the mechanics up enough to get rid of bad player habits like backstab fishing and chain backstabbing, while leaving room for other fun mechanics to still work. Power stancing is one of the best new mechanics in the game, allowing the player to use two weapons at once and gain access to new movesets and combos, which is more satisfying than the twin weapons of Dark Souls 3. There is, however, the addition of weapons having sweet spots, which I really like the concept of, but usually just becomes a pain to deal with. I also think that the weird movement isn't as much of a problem in PvP as it is in other aspects of the game. But when talking about the general PvE experience, the movement is definitely still a factor. Regardless, even in PvE, I feel like the combat is still one of the strongest parts of the game. I think that a lot of it actually comes down to build variety and leveling. The upgrade and leveling system is at its best in Dark Souls 2. First off, leveling up just has a bit of a better and more clear stat system than it did in previous games. Also, they made the addition of being able to reset your stats and respec if you want. One issue that I have though, which ties into the movement problem, is that the agility stat isn't explained in-game very well, and neither is how to upgrade it. It is so bad, in fact, that I didn't even know it was a stat until a few months ago. Agility, for those that don't know, is a stat in Dark Souls 2 that goes up when putting points into attunement or adaptability. This stat determines how fast you use items and your invincibility frames when rolling or backstepping. In Dark Souls 2, your base agility starts at less than 100, regardless of which class you start as, meaning that you have less iframes than you do in other Souls games. Without knowing this, rolling to dodge attacks is always going to feel like it doesn't really work, because your iframes aren't as high as you are probably used to. I honestly hate that this stat is a thing, and it's the only thing I dislike about the leveling system in Dark Souls 2. What I do like, though, is that they removed the confusing upgrade material system from Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, with their individual upgrade materials for each type of weapon or upgrade path. Instead, they said Titanite shards are for normal weapons, Twinkling Titanite is for special weapons, and Petrified Dragon Bones are for boss weapons. They made it easy to understand, which was a huge benefit. On top of that, armor is actually useful, upgradable, and has working poise, unlike in Dark Souls 3. It makes a huge difference having armor that actually decreases the damage you take, and it makes it worth your time to upgrade stats to use better armor. It's not just for the fashion souls. Also, infusions are at their best in Dark Souls 2. Almost every weapon, staff, shield, etc. in the game can be infused with one of 9 different infusions. Most infusions make a weapon deal split damage and scale with the corresponding stat to that damage type, without horribly reducing the base scale. Weapons that already have split damage can be infused to make them do more of that damage type, and on top of that, the weapon can usually still be buffed with spells. There's also the Mundane Infusion, which has been heavily nerfed, but used to do insane damage on things like the Dagger and the Evelyn. Shields could be infused to have immunity to certain damage types. Staffs, chimes, and other spellcasting focuses could be infused to make spells do more damage. The amount that infusions can do helped create the insane build diversity of the game. Dark Souls 2's best aspect, without a doubt, is the build diversity. There's an incredible amount of entirely unique weapons, spells, and armor sets. In Dark Souls 2, nearly every single piece of equipment is viable in both PvP and PvE. The spells are probably the most unique and usable in any of the games. Playing a mage, pyromancer, or cleric build is actually incredibly fun, which is something I can't really say with as much confidence for any of the other games. People have done so many incredible things, such as insane one-shot builds, plunging attack builds, poison, fire, lightning, Shrek, whatever you can think of, someone has probably made it and done well with it. I cannot really make it clear just how much build diversity really makes Dark Souls 2. Enemy and boss quality is one of the hardest things to talk about in Dark Souls 2, because the quality varies so drastically. On the one hand, there are great bosses and great enemies, but, and that's a big but, there are also some of the worst designs in the series. One thing I should definitely mention is that I think lots of the bad designs actually do come down to the weird way things move in the game, and if the game were to function in a more similar fashion to the other games, they might not be as bad. However, this is not true for all of them, some are just really bad. There are some fantastic bosses in Dark Souls 2, like the Pursuer, which can be fought for the first time not even in the boss arena, but just out in the world, and also shows up multiple times throughout the game, and even more in Scholar of the First Sin, giving you the feeling that it's actually hunting you. Yeah, the Pursuer's design might be a little bland and the fight might be a little on the easy side, but I don't think that takes too much away from what they were going for with the boss. The Looking Glass Knight is another awesome boss fight that players can even invade. Not be the boss like the Old Monk or Spear of the Church, but actually invade and help the boss. Velstad the Royal Aegis, as much as I personally am not a fan of the fight, I recognize as a boss that most people love. The Executioner's Chariot is conceptually such a cool boss that unfortunately the actual fight for is not fantastic. Moving on to some of the enemies, I'm a huge fan of the Hyde Knights, as I'm sure many others also are. The Scion Knights are a really good fit as the Royal Guard of Drangleic. The Elan Knights are awesome looking and are a good representation of the lore surrounding the Iron King. It just sucks that they are heavily affected by the weird movement in the game. There are more good enemy and boss designs that I haven't mentioned, but I also find that most in the game fall into the average category, and aren't really anything too spectacular or too trash. Before moving on to the bad boss designs, I would like to state that there are two bosses that I don't think get enough credit, and are often shoved off as bad bosses when they really aren't. The Covetous Demon and the Dragon Rider. Obviously, the double Dragon Rider boss fight is lazy and bad, but the original Dragon Rider boss fight is perfectly fine for an early game boss, and the fact that you can make it fall off the arena isn't really problematic either. It gives new players an opportunity to learn and take advantage of the situation. The Covetous Demon is a boss that I actually quite like, despite the fact that most people hate it. Yes, it's super easy and doesn't really have any chance of killing the player, but isn't that kind of the point? It's supposed to be an easy joke boss that is more about setting up the lore of the area than it is meant to be a difficult fight, so I don't think that makes it bad. There are, however, quite a few bad bosses in the game, starting off with probably the most obvious two, the Twin Dragon Riders and the Prowling Magus and Congregation. I get that both of them are supposed to be mini roadblocks along the way to the real boss later on, but that doesn't excuse that one is just a copy and paste of an earlier boss, and that the other is just a group of basic enemies. Then there's the old Dragon Slayer, which is just half of one of the best bosses in the first game, only now the AI is bad and the movements are really awkward. And of course, the Royal Rats are both garbage bosses that could have potentially been interesting considering they're both tied to the Rat Covenant. Then there's the Ancient Dragon, which is not only burdened with having stupid high defenses and damage, but also having probably the worst run to a boss in the entire game in the Scholar of the First Sin edition. Lastly, there's Nishandra and Aldia, who for the last bosses in the game are incredibly underwhelming and just boring to fight. Let's of course not forget some of the atrocious basic enemies in the game, the crystal lizards that disappear before you can even get near them, the horrid exploding prisoners, the giants that don't have hitboxes, the dreaded pigs in Majula, and my personal least favorite, the always facing you no matter what fire salamanders. There are many more basic enemies that I didn't mention that are of the not-so-great variety, but still I find it hard to say that the overall boss and enemy design is terrible. I think the good counteracts the bad, and we end up with the average. So I would say that in Dark Souls 2, the enemy and boss design is really just okay, not to be praised and not to be horribly bashed. The expansions of Dark Souls 2 are really hard things to decide whether or not I like, because they have some aspects that make me want to love them, but some that are just too awful to overlook. Starting with the first DLC, The Crown of the Sunken King, I think the level design is one of the best in the game. Shulva is beautiful, and I think they did a marvelous job of creating a poison environment that isn't just garbage like all of the others in the series. The moving platforms and puzzles are executed spectacularly for the capabilities of the game. Other than the poison statue turtles and the acid bugs, I think all of the enemies are great. The general undead soldiers of the city are fine enough enemies, and they show off the aesthetic of the expansion well, with their poison-touched armor and weapons. The Sanctum Knights are one of my favorite enemies in the game. I really love the idea of having to break their armor to be able to hurt them with means other than magic. The Sanctum Sorceresses and the Drakeblood Knights are also quite enjoyable, even if the Drakebloods are just standard NPCs. Even the ridiculous creatures called the Imperfect are quite interesting. The bosses, however, are something I'm really not too keen on in Shulva. Alana is fine, but she really just summons other things and they become more of the boss than she is. Sin, as much as I know some people love, I can just never stand. He breaks your weapons ridiculously fast, his hitboxes are wonky as hell, and he spends most of the boss fight flying around. And of course, the NPC fight is garbage. No explanation should be needed for that. I do like that there are new spells though, as well as some interesting new weapons, like the Puzzling Stone Sword. Lastly, as with all of the co-op areas, I think they are an incredibly neat idea that could have been a huge hit, but all of them really suck and the bosses at the end are all bad. However, this is probably my favorite of them, even though I still think it sucks. So overall, for the Crown of the Sunken King, I think it has a lot of redeemable qualities and comes out for the most part on the good side, but the quality of the boss fights in the trash that is the Cave of the Dead puts it, for me, at slightly above average quality. The Crown of the Iron King is probably my favorite of the expansions, but that's not to say there isn't a lot that I don't like about it. The Broom Tower is incredible in design, and I quite like the switch to a more vertical level design. I also greatly appreciate the need to go back through and re-explore areas after acquiring the Scorching Iron Scepter. The enemy design does leave something to be desired though. The basic enemies are just the same as they were in Shulva, only with different weapons and a different aesthetic. I found these enemies fine in Shulva, but I really didn't care to just see them reused without really making any actual change. The possessed armor and iron warriors are fine, but nothing really that fantastic, and the rest of the enemies are kind of the same. The bosses are the best in this DLC for sure, but still only one is high quality. The Aged Smelter Demon is fine, but it's just a lazy reskin at the end of probably the worst area in the game. Sir Alon, as much as it will piss people off to hear, is in my opinion an overhyped average boss at the end of an irritating run. And the Fume Knight is probably the best boss in the entire game. I also like how the lore of the Fume Knight connects him to the base game and the story of King Vendrick. Again, new spells and weapons are great. The thing that really brings this expansion down for me is that there is not one, but two of the terrible co-op areas. Both the Iron Passage and the Memory of the Old Iron King are just not enjoyable areas to play through. Then there are also the irritating areas packed with enemies and Ashen Idols to buff them. So for me, I'd see this DLC as my favorite, but still not that great, but pushing itself closer to good than the Sunken King, simply because the boss quality is higher. The Crown of the Ivory King is my least favorite of the expansions in Dark Souls 2. Even though, like most, I am generally a sucker for snow areas, this one just doesn't quite do it for me. It's very beautiful, yes, but it's also a little uninspired, especially in comparison to the other DLCs. As with the Broom Tower, I really like the need to re-explore the map once the blizzard is gone. I'm always a fan of going back through areas I'm familiar with once things have changed, and I feel like Aleum Lois does an even better job of that than the Broom Tower. When it comes to enemies, they just reskin the same basic enemies from the first DLC again, only this time made some of them unable to be backstabbed. The Rampart Golems and Ice Elementals are fine and look cool, the Hedgehogs are terrible, the Retainers are an interesting idea but not great, and then Giants are just kind of alright. I like that they tried something different with NPC invaders in this DLC, having Holy Knight Arheim use Chameleon and having Maldron pretend to be friendly. They were both nice touches. As for the bosses, I think Ava is fine, I think Lud and Zolin are lazy and bad, and I think the Burned Ivory King is one of the best bosses in the game. When it comes to the Ivory King, I love the setup that they have with collecting the Lois Knights to fight alongside you, and then having an actual battle before the boss even shows up. It's easily one of the most awe-inspiring moments in the series. The fight against the Ivory King himself is well put together and feels good, but as much as I like the lore behind him, it really just is Artorias' story a second time. Again, new spells and weapons are awesome. I particularly like the Ivory King's Greatsword. Then of course I have to mention the Frigid Outskirts, which I don't think are as bad as the Iron Passage, but are still just so awful. I get what they were going for with waiting out the blizzards, and I like it conceptually, but it's just executed so poorly, and then with the addition of the reindeer only to end in a terrible boss fight, it's just not worth the time. Overall, I'd say the Crown of the Ivory King is still at least okay, but I don't think that it really has as many redeeming qualities as the other two expansions. Now let's talk about the Skull of the First Sin Edition. It's not great. There are a few qualities that I like, but it really is just a worse version of Dark Souls 2. There are some better item placements, and some of the switches to the game's progression are okay, and of course the Pursuer spawning in more locations is good, but really they just threw in a ton of enemies and re-released the game. There really isn't much else to say about it. I don't like it, and it sucks that it's really the only available version of the game on most platforms. The online quality of Dark Souls 2 is probably the best in the series. The connection issues can still be a bit of a problem, which is definitely improved with later installments, but it still works well for the most part. The community is still surprisingly active 6 years after the game's release, summon signs still pop up somewhat consistently, and people are still looking to invade or duel. One of the greatest additions in Dark Souls 2 that people often forget about is the small white sign soapstone, which allows shades to come to your world and help you regardless of whether or not you have beat the boss. They are also not affected by soul memory. The correct red and blue eye orbs work well for invasions as they had in Dark Souls 1. The only unfortunate thing is that there is no infinite use item for invasions. The red sign soapstone still functions great as well, and the fact that you can be invaded even if you have defeated the area boss really helps the online play stay active. There is, however, one thing that really brings down the online of Dark Souls 2, soul memory. Soul memory, for those that don't know, is a system that is only present in Dark Souls 2 that sets your matchmaking capabilities. Pretty much, it takes into account the max amount of souls that you have gained on the chosen character, and matches your invasions and summons with people in a similar range. This is not nearly as effective as it might sound. This can block you from playing with friends super easily, or it can stop you from interacting with players if you haven't been leveling your character up past a certain point. In Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls Remastered, they set it up based on soul level and weapon level, which is not ideal but functions a little better than soul memory. Covenants are another gigantic part of online play. Most people can generally agree that if Dark Souls 2 has anything going for it, it's Covenants. The Brotherhood of Blood is the standard invasion covenant, but also has an arena in which members of the covenant can battle each other. To contrast that, there is the Blue Sentinels, which can invade as spirits of vengeance, which target those who have invaded others with red eye orbs, or they can be summoned in to help fight against invaders. The Blue Sentinels also have an arena for their covenant. Both of these covenants have rewards that add visual effects to the player when they invade, which is much more worthwhile than the garbage rewards you get in Dark Souls 3. The Way of Blue Covenant is for players that want help when they get invaded. They are given the ability to summon Blue Sentinels for assistance if they should be invaded. The Bellkeeper Covenant allows players to invade others when they are in either of the belfries, similar to the Watchdogs of Faerun in Dark Souls 3 or the Forest Hunters in Dark Souls 1. The Warriors of Sunlight Covenant is meant for jolly cooperation, which is for PvP and PvE. There are the Dragon Remnants, which allow the player to place a sign to invade and claim dragon scales, eventually gaining access to the best-looking dragon form in the series. And the last of the PvP covenants, the Rat Covenant, summons other players who enter the rat areas into your world to fight. There are, however, 2 PvE-only covenants. There is the Covenant of Champions, which increases damage taken and makes enemies permanently respawn, while also increasing drop rates and the player's damage with fists. And then last but not least is the Pilgrims of the Dark, which grants the player access to 3 short PvE areas, and upon completion, the chance to fight the Dark Lurker, a boss exclusive to the Covenant. All of the covenants in the game are so unique and help define the game, and it's clear that a lot of effort went into establishing a community for the game. One of the last things I want to talk about is that Dark Souls 2 actually has a New Game Plus. Yes, all of the other games have New Game Plus, I am well aware of that, but none of them have a New Game Plus that is really worth playing. In every other game in the series, you just replay through the game with slightly stronger enemies, and then in Dark Souls 3, you get some upgraded rings that they just ended up giving better versions of in the Ringed City anyway. The most use New Game Plus has is being able to play through the game again on the same character, and maybe get some boss weapons that were missed in a previous playthrough. In Dark Souls 2, it actually becomes worth something. They switch up some enemy placements and add some new ones. Black Phantom NPCs and regular enemies are placed to keep things fresh. Some chests are replaced with mimics, so players have to be cautious and aware. They even made some items exclusive to different game cycles, as well as giving some bosses new boss souls, which can be used for new weapons and spells. The game even has some unique events in New Game Plus, like being able to fight Freya briefly in Upper Brightstone, and have the damage dealt there actually affect the boss fight. There is also an item that allows players to change the game cycle for a specific area and go into a pseudo New Game Plus. They added these incredible improvements that enhance the game's replayability, making Dark Souls 2, in my opinion, the most replayable game in the series. But for some reason, they didn't keep these changes in later games. It's strange to me that they wouldn't try to make the other games better by simply adding New Game Plus features when it so obviously benefited Dark Souls 2. There are a few other things in the game that I didn't exactly know how to fit into any of the other sections, so I'll just mention them briefly now before wrapping everything up. There are little things like how burning the mill in Earthen Peak reduces the poison in Mitha's boss fight and around the rest of the area, or how lighting all the sconces and things betwixt spawns a red phantom. They also added Estus shards, although not the best with the excessive amount of healing in Dark Souls 2, paved the way for how well it worked in Dark Souls 3. Environmental effects like snow or poison covering the player helps the world feel more real. The fact that NPCs can be temporarily revived is a huge benefit in comparison to how much you could screw yourself over by attacking an NPC in Dark Souls 1. Even something weird like being able to cast spells while looking through binoculars adds to the heart of the game. There are even more things that I mentioned, but they all just give a little extra something to the game that defines its identity. Taking everything that I've mentioned into consideration, do I think Dark Souls 2 is a bad game? No, absolutely not. Do I think it's a bad Souls game? Still no. I think it's a perfectly fine game. Yes, it has flaws, some may be a bit more obvious than in the other games, but that doesn't make it some abomination. It's still an enjoyable experience and well worth your time to play. If you disagree, that's totally fine. This is just my opinion. I think the game is viewed so harshly because most people aren't willing to see the flaws in the other games, whereas when it comes to Dark Souls 2, people see a flaw or two and jump on the hate bandwagon. In my eyes, Dark Souls 3 has just as many, if not more flaws as a game than Dark Souls 2, which is why both games are tied for the bottom place on my list of Souls games. That doesn't mean that I don't love these games, because I absolutely do. I just like the other games more. I think something people in the gaming community forget a lot is that games are allowed to have flaws. Nothing is perfect and nothing ever will be. And it's for that reason that I can say Dark Souls 2, regardless of its flaws, is one of my favorite games. Hey, thanks for watching. I know the video quality wasn't fantastic on this, but I'm still learning how everything works, so hopefully that'll improve in the future. At the moment, my plan is to do similar things to this, just maybe a little less long form, just talking about video games that I enjoy, why I enjoy them, and I'll maybe do some other fun stuff too, but we'll see how things go at first. Probably start streaming eventually just to get some footage and all. As of the day I'm recording this, Mortal Shell comes out tomorrow, so I'll probably make a video on that soon. But other than that, yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed.